10.1 1.
Harper Lee is the woman who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird.
I'm looking for a book which teaches you how to relax.
That's the house where I was born.
2.
Is Frank the man whose brother plays for Manchester United?
It's a tree whose leaves change colour in autumn.
3.
I've just had a text from the girl I met on the flight to Paris.
This is the phone I bought yesterday.
10.2
This painting, which was painted in 1860, is worth millions of pounds.
Last week I visited my Aunt Jane, who's nearly 90 years old.
Burford, where my grandfather was born, is a beautiful little town.
My neighbour, whose son goes to my son's school, has just remarried.
10.3 1.
In 1924, the Post Office organised a competition to design a new phone box. The winner was the architect Giles Gilbert Scott.
2.
George Carwadine licensed his design for the Anglepoise desk lamp to a company who brought it out in 1935.
3.
The classic penguin book cover was designed by Edward Young in 1946.
4.
In 1966, Mary Quant saw a group of tap dancers at a nearby school, which inspired her to create the miniskirt.
10.4 1. The red phone box.
In 1924, the Post Office organised a competition to design a new phone box. The winner was the architect Giles Gilbert Scott, who also designed Liverpool Cathedral and the building that is now Tate Modern. The first phone box was built in London in 1926. It was painted red to make it easy to see at a distance, although Scott had originally suggested silver with a blue interior. With the arrival of mobile phones in the 21st century, people didn't need phone boxes anymore, and most of them have now been removed. However, today they are considered design icons of historic importance, and several are now tourist attractions, including one of the original ones next to the Royal Academy of Arts in Piccadilly. Others have found new lives in local communities as mini libraries or art galleries, and a very few still survive as working phones.
2. The Anglepoise lamp.
George Carwadine was an engineer who specialised in suspension systems for cars. He worked for car manufacturers for several years, but when the company he was working for went bankrupt, he decided to set up a small company on his own. He had a little workshop in his garden, and there he designed a lamp which could be moved in different directions, inspired by the human arm. He licensed his design to a company which made the springs for his lamps, and in 1935 they brought out the 3-spring Anglepoise desk lamp. It was an instant success, and the exact same model, the Anglepoise 1227, is still made today. Carwadine later developed many variations on the original design, including lamps for hospital operating theatres and for military aeroplanes. But it is the classic, ever-popular Anglepoise 1227 which is today considered an iconic British design.
3. The penguin book covers.
Penguin Books was started in 1935, although the classic cover was not designed until 11 years later. In 1935, publisher Alan Lane was at a bookstall on a railway platform, looking for something to read. but he could only find magazines. He decided that people needed to be able to buy books that were good quality fiction but cheap, and not just in traditional bookshops, but also on railway stations and in chain stores. Lane wanted a dignified but amusing symbol for the new books, and his secretary suggested a penguin. So graphic designer Edward Young was sent to London Zoo to make drawings of penguins. The first penguin paperbacks appeared in the summer of 1935. They included the works of Agatha Christie and the American writer Ernest Hemingway. The classic book cover was designed by Young in 1946. The books were colour-coded: orange for fiction, blue for biography, and green for crime. The way people thought about books had changed forever. The paperback revolution had begun. The cover designs of Penguin books have changed a lot over the years. But the original 1946 cover, which is considered a design icon, was recently brought back and is also used on mugs, notebooks, and other items.
4. The miniskirt.
The 1960s was famous for many things, from the Beatles to the first man on the moon. But the miniskirt remains one of the decade's most long-lasting icons. Mary Quant was a British fashion designer who had a boutique called Bazaar in the King's Road, the most fashionable shopping street of the time. As a girl, she had always tried to make her school uniform skirt shorter, to be more exciting looking. In 1966, she saw a group of tap dancers at a nearby school in very short skirts, with socks and dance shoes. This inspired her to create the miniskirt, which she named after her favourite car, the Mini. However, the miniskirt was not popular with everyone. Coco Chanel described it as just awful, but Quant's customers loved it. Before the 1960s, young women had been expected to dress like their mothers, but this was about young people looking young. Although 1960s fashion soon changed to the long hippie clothes of the 1970s, the miniskirt has never disappeared and is still worn today by women of all ages all over the world.
10.5.
Paperback.
Book cover.
Child prodigy.
Car manufacturer.
Desk lamp.
Songwriter.
Phone box.
10.6. 1,
Detectives.
2,
Witnesses.
3,
Victims.
4,
Murderer.
5,
Murder.
6,
Evidence.
7,
Suspects.
8,
Solve.
9.
Prove.
10.7. Part 1.
Good morning, and thank you for coming, Mr. Morton. Or should it be Inspector Morton? You were a detective with Scotland Yard, weren't you?
Yes, that's right. For 25 years. I retired last year.
People today are still fascinated by the identity of Jack the Ripper, over 130 years after the crimes were committed. It's incredible, isn't it?
Well, it's not really that surprising. People are always interested in unsolved murders, and Jack the Ripper has become a sort of cult horror figure.
So, what can you tell us about some of the new theories about his identity?
Well, a recent new theory was put forward by a crime historian called Jan Bonderson. He thinks that Jack the Ripper was a Dutch sailor called Hendrik de Jong.
What evidence does he have?
Well, de Jong was definitely a murderer. He killed 4 women in Holland and Belgium, including 2 of his ex-wives. He also travelled to London a lot, and he was there when the Jack the Ripper murders took place. He also matches the descriptions we have of Jack the Ripper.
How credible is his theory?
Well, even Dr. Bonderson says that it's impossible to know for certain if de Jong was Jack the Ripper. I would say it's possible, but there isn't really enough conclusive evidence.
10.8. Part 2.
The next recent theory I'm interested in comes from the film director Bruce Robinson, who wrote a book in 2016 called They All Love Jack. What can you tell us about it?
Bruce Robinson is convinced that Jack the Ripper was in fact Michael Maybrick, the brother of one of the original suspects, James Maybrick. He thinks that the style of the murders indicates that there was a connection with the Freemasons, which both brothers were.
What did Michael do?
He was a popular singer and composer of songs at the time, and Robinson thinks that the Ripper's letters are similar in style to some of his songs, and the fact that they were posted from so many different parts of the UK makes sense because Michael was on tour at the time. Robinson thinks he was a psychopath and was responsible for at least 16 more murders that took place in England later. He even thinks that Michael went on to murder his brother James.
But he was never arrested, was he?
No, he wasn't. However, Bruce thinks that by 1893 the police had begun to suspect him, but because many of the police themselves were Freemasons, they allowed him to escape to the Isle of Wight, where he lived for the rest of his life.
And what do you think?
I think the book is well researched, but I don't really believe his conspiracy theory, that the police knew it was Michael and let him get away. I think the reason the Ripper was never caught was because the police were incompetent, not corrupt.
10.9. Part 3.
Finally, let's talk about Patricia Cornwell's research. In her 2002 book Jack the Ripper, Case Closed, she said that she had identified the murderer and that she was convinced that Jack the Ripper was in fact Walter Sickert, the painter. What evidence did she put forward to support this claim?
Well, she mainly used DNA analysis. She actually spent over £2 million buying 32 paintings by Sickert. She cut up one of them to get the DNA from it. People in the art world were furious.
I can imagine.
And then she compared the DNA from the painting with DNA taken from the letters that Jack the Ripper sent to the police. Patricia Cornwell said that she was 99% certain that Walter Sickert was Jack the Ripper.
And now she's written a new book with more evidence.
Yes, it's called Ripper, The Secret Life of Walter Sickert. She says she's found new evidence, including letters which were written by Jack the Ripper and by Walter Sickert on the same very unusual type of paper. She also points out that some of his paintings are very violent and frightening.
But you don't think she's right, do you?
Well, I think she might be right. She has a lot of evidence, although I don't think it's completely reliable, and a lot of people think she's wrong.
So, who do you think the murderer was?
I can't tell you, because I don't know.
Do you think we'll ever solve the mystery?
Yes, I think one day the mystery will be solved. Some new evidence will appear that proves 100% who Jack the Ripper was, and we'll be able to say that the case is finally closed. But at the moment, it's still a mystery, and people like a good mystery.
10.10. 1.
You were a detective with Scotland Yard, weren't you?
2.
It's incredible, isn't it?
3.
But he was never arrested, was he?
4.
But you don't think she's right, do you?
10.11. Positive verb, negative tag.
It's cold today, isn't it?
You're Polish, aren't you?
They live in London, don't they?
The match finishes at 8, doesn't it?
Your sister worked in the USA, didn't she?
We've met before, haven't we?
You'll be okay, won't you?
You'd lend me some money, wouldn't you?
Negative verb, positive tag.
She isn't here today, is she?
You aren't angry, are you?
They don't eat meat, do they?
Lucy doesn't drive, does she?
You didn't like the film, did you?
Mike hasn't been to Rome before, has he?
You won't tell anyone, will you?
Sue wouldn't resign, would she?
10.12.
Your surname's Jones, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And you're 27, aren't you?
Yes, that's right.
You weren't at home last night at 8 o'clock, were you?
No, I wasn't. I was at the theatre.
But you don't have any witnesses, do you?
Yes, I do. My wife was with me.
Your wife wasn't with you, was she?
How do you know?
Because she was with me, at the police station. We arrested her yesterday.
10.13. 1,
Your surname's Jones, isn't it?
2,
And you're 27, aren't you?
3,
You weren't at home last night at 8 o'clock, were you?
4,
But you don't have any witnesses, do you?
5,
Your wife wasn't with you, was she?
10.14. May and June by Ruth Rendell. Part 1.
Mr. and Mrs. Thrace called their daughters May and June because of the months when they were born. May was the oldest. She was changeable like the month, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, and neither pretty nor clever. June, however, was both, and her sunny personality brought her many admirers. When May was 20, she met a young lawyer called Walter. He was extremely good-looking, and his father was wealthy. May fell passionately in love with him. He asked her to marry him, and of course she accepted. During that time, May almost became beautiful, but the intensity of her passion frightened Mrs. Thrace. June was away from home studying to be a teacher when May and Walter got engaged, so Walter had never met her. But a month before the wedding, June came home for the summer holidays. It was all very unfortunate, Mrs. Thrace said over and over again. If Walter had left May for some unknown girl, they would have been furious. But what could they say or do when he had fallen in love with their younger daughter? May became violent and tried to attack June with a knife.
"We're all terribly sorry for you, darling,"
said Mrs. Thrace.
I shall never marry now,
said May.
She's ruined my life. She stole my husband.
"He wasn't your husband, May,"
her mother replied. When June and Walter came to visit, May always went out, but she knew about them because she always read June's letters to her mother. She knew that they had a big house, that they collected furniture and pictures, and that they didn't have any children. She knew where they went for their holidays and who their friends were. but she could never discover if Walter loved June or not. She thought that perhaps he was sorry that he had married June and not her. This thought was the only thing that comforted her.
(10.15) Part 2.
May never married, and she continued to live at home for over 30 years until her parents died. Mrs. Thrace died in March, and her husband 6 months later. At her father's funeral, May saw Walter and June again. Walter was still good-looking, and May wanted to die when she saw him.
"Please come and speak to your sister,"
he said to her. But May refused. It was only at another funeral that they were reconciled. May learnt of Walter's death from the newspaper, and the pain was as great as when her mother had told her that Walter wanted to marry June. Inside the church, her sister came up to May and asked her to forget about the past.
"Now you know what it's like to lose him,"
May said. 2 days later, May got a letter from June. June asked her to come and live with her now that they were both alone.
"Now that you've retired and haven't got very much money, I'd like to share my beautiful house with you,"
she wrote.
"Perhaps this way I can give you something in return for what I took away from you."
May decided to accept. She thought it was right. During their first evening together, she asked June to talk about her marriage, about her life with Walter. But June didn't want to talk. May looked in the house for letters or presents from Walter, jewellery or pictures. She couldn't find anything. Even June's wedding ring wasn't as beautiful as the engagement ring Walter had given May all those years ago.
"He never really loved her,"
she thought.
"All these years he loved me."
She decided to start wearing her engagement ring again, on her little finger, which was the only one it now fitted.
(10.16) Part 3.
May never cried now, though June did.
"I'm an old fool. I can't help it. You're strong, May, but I'm weak. And I miss Walter so."
"I missed him too,"
said May.
"He was always fond of you,"
said June.
"He often talked about you. You have forgiven me, haven't you, May?"
"As a matter of fact, I have,"
said May.
"I think you've been punished for what you did." It was a marriage without love,
she thought.
Walter probably talked constantly about me.
For the first time in 40 years, she was happy. One night, May woke up and heard a noise.
A burglar,
she thought. She put on her dressing gown and went to June's room. The bed was empty. She looked out of the window and saw a car parked outside the house and a light in the living room window. Then she heard a cry and saw a man running out of the house, covered in blood. He got into the car and drove away. May went into the living room. June was standing next to her desk. This was a desk which she always kept locked, so May had never been able to see what was in it. The desk was open now, and the contents were all over the room. There was broken glass on the floor, and a gun. May went up to her.
Are you all right?
Yes, I'm fine. I threw a bottle at him and he ran away. He pointed a gun at me, but I wasn't afraid. He only took a few pieces of silver. He heard you coming and he panicked.
Suddenly, May saw a letter which was open in the desk. It was a letter to June from Walter, the last one he wrote to her when he was dying.
My darling love, I want to tell you how happy I have been all these years with you. If I die, I want you to know that you are the only woman I have ever loved.
Could you call the police, please, May?
Asked June.
Yes,
said May. She picked up the gun. The police arrived 15 minutes later. They brought a doctor with them. But June was already dead.
Don't worry, Miss Thrace. We'll catch the person who did this,
said the inspector.
But it's a pity you touched the gun. I suppose you weren't thinking.
That's right,
said May.
It was the shock. I've never had a shock like that. Not since I was a girl.
(10.17) 1.
Have you ever helped a stranger or been helped by a stranger?
Yes, a few months ago I was catching a train home from work and I went past a little girl with her two grandparents and she was crying and she was really unhappy. And I thought, oh dear, but there's nothing I can do. So I went into the station and I went up the stairs, over the bridge, down the other side. And then on the floor I saw a little toy panda. And immediately I knew that that was the little girl's panda and that's why she was crying. So I ran back up the stairs, over the bridge, out of the station, and I saw the family in the car park. I could still hear the little girl crying. And I ran up and said, "Is this yours?" And the little girl took it, and the grandparents just said, "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you." So that was nice.
2.
Do you think we rely too much on technology?
Oh, absolutely. I think we really, especially our mobile phones, once upon a time, I've travelled a lot, so I used to rely on maps, and I would, the night before, when I'm travelling, I'd map out where I was going to go and have it all in my head ready to go. Now I just pull out my phone and use Google Maps.
Are there any devices you just couldn't live without?
Yes, probably my mobile phone.
3.
Do you like detective or mystery novels or TV series?
Yeah, I have done. So I really like the Nordic noirs that were very popular a few years ago, so like The Killing and The Bridge especially I found really fascinating.
Do you have a favourite author or detective?
Yes, but can I remember her name? It's actually the one in The Bridge.
Do you usually guess who the murderer is?
I'll always try. Sometimes I get it, sometimes it's too difficult, yeah.
4.
Do you have a favourite designer?
I've recently started wedding dress shopping and I really like the dresses by Maggie Sottero.
Why do you like her clothes?
The dresses are quite a vintage style, which is really flattering, and when I've tried them on, I think they're probably the ones I'm going to go for.
5.
Do you think you are generally a lucky person?
Yes, I do, actually. I do think I'm lucky.
Can you think of a time when you've been really lucky?
I can think of an awful lot of times when I've been really, really lucky. I had a car accident many, many years ago, and even the police didn't know how I got out of it alive, so I think that really says it all.